This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I am Jose Enrique Rioja, in today for Brian Winter. In this episode, we'll do a deep dive into the current political and economic situation in Chile, as the country approaches the day when citizens will vote on a new proposed constitution. What does this moment mean for Chile as a whole and for President Gabriel Boric?
I think today, because anything that happens will benefit the right, the question is really which right? So if the text is rejected, I think that's better for the center right, for the more moderate right, and probably also for economic interests. Whereas if the text is approved, I think that will lead to further tensions, and it would strengthen the extreme right, the populist right of caste, and would probably enhance the chances of that group to gain the presidency.
This week was an important one for Chileans and for President Gabriel Boric. On Tuesday, the president officially received a second proposal to replace the country's dictatorship-era constitution, and he called for a national plebiscite to be held on December 17. It has been, no doubt, a long, drawn-out process, one which many Chileans just want to get past. It is a paradoxical moment for President Boric, who ascended politically as a part of social movements that call for a new chapter that would embody progressive idea for the country. A new expansive constitution was proposed and got rejected in September of last year, at the time when a fragile economy, migration, and rise in crime made the population tilt conservative. The president now has to shepherd through the voting process of a new draft, which, according to our guest, is even more right-wing than the constitution enacted during the ruling of Augusto Pinochet. So today, we'll take a step back and we'll look at this moment for Chile. What is the political move of the country as it prepares to vote in December, and what all this means for Chilean politics in the coming months and even years? We'll talk about the new constitutional draft, how it compares to the current one, and we'll review the implications for the average citizens in Chile. But at the same time, we'll look more broadly at the status of the left and the right, at Gabriel Boric's political future, and at the state of the economy. For that, we have invited a well-known observer of Chilean politics, Professor Claudia Heiss. She is the head of political science at Universidad de Chile's School of Government. Claudia, welcome to the AQ podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We are right now, walking towards the end of 2023, and this is another socialist president who is facing a second attempt to actually redraft the constitution. What do you think is actually, happening behind, the scenes in all of this very symbolic ceremony that we're seeing today from the President Gabriel Boric?
Well, it's actually extremely paradoxical because Boric is receiving, as you said, a left-wing president, the most left-wing president we've had since the return to democracy in 1990. He received a text that is so much to the right that it's even more conservative than the Pinochet constitution. So paradoxically, what this whole process led us towards was a more conservative movement focused on reinforcing private property, making explicit things that in the 1980 constitution were implicit. For instance, the pension system in the 1980 constitution is not completely explicit. The private pension system, that it was an invention of Chile, that was not in the 1980 constitution because that system was created after the 1980 constitution. And so the creator of this system, which is an intellectual that works at the Cato Institute in Washington, wrote an article saying that he's very happy about the new proposal because now, finally, something that was not explicit in the 1980 Pinochet constitution, it's now explicit in this new draft by the Republican Party.
Knowing this paradox that you already described, okay, this sort of inherent tension within the society, how would you describe this moment? How do you describe Is something special this morning in Santiago de Chile that you can feel, that you can share with other audience about this pivotal moment for Chile?
I think it's a moment of discouragement. It's a sad moment because we have been unable to agree on a basic rules that allow every political sector to feel that they have an even field to do regular politics. And so the first proposal was rejected by the right because the right was not included. The right had a minority at that moment. The participation was voluntary, so only half of the electorate voted to elect the first convention, and that convention tilted towards the left and passed the regulations without the consent of the right. And now we replicated the same mistake with a right-wing constitution that did not need center or left votes, and that simply didn't take into account the requests of the left to have a social, what they call a social state of law, right? Un estado social y democrático de derecho. That was the main clause the left wanted to put in the constitution. So to make sure that distributive politics were not done by the constitution, but were possible under this constitutional scheme. And that was not really allowed. And well, so now we're replicating the same problem as before.
What is, from your point of view, being a scholar, being a professor, teaching political science in Chile for several years now, what is the spirit of this new draft of the Constitution?
It really wants to stress the Chilean identity. It has patriotic values like a cultural reaction to the previous text regarding gender and sex, for instance, sex and gender minorities' rights, regarding sexual and reproductive rights of women. So it's a very culturally conservative text that wants to reinforce conservative values, conservative Catholic values through the Constitution. It's also a text that wants to make sure that these redistributive policies are not constitutional. So it reinforces or strengthens the orientation of the previous constitution with more explicit norms that were already there, but not as explicit as now. And I think in general, it's a reinforcement of the ideology that was behind the 1980 constitution, the original 1980 constitution. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to many years of political instability, of the damage the social outbursts made to many people. It was a very traumatic episode. We all, even if you supported the social mobilization or if you supported redistributive politics, it's very traumatic when, traffic lights don't work and you can go out in the street and there's violence, there was looting. So it was not only peaceful social protests. We had a lot of violence. Churches were burned. Public infrastructure and private infrastructure was destroyed. I think people really are longing for order, for security, and also for economic stability. We had the pandemic, a very sharp increase in unemployment. We've had inflation. We never had this level of inflation since the return to democracy, since 1990. So inflation, decrease of employment, public disorder, all of this contributed to this conservative switch. Some people think that Chilean society is becoming more and more polarized. Many social scientists have argued that really the polarization is more prevalent among elites than among citizens. When you ask citizens, there's still a centrist tendency. People are not polarized on the ground per se. But when the elites are offering more and more polarized options, that influences society. So we are, I think, seeing a trend that is dangerous because it can trigger greater polarization among society.
Do you believe that this new text will sort of increase the polarization or the trend of polarization within the Chilean society?
I do. I think it's an exclusionary text. It's a text that doesn't encompass roughly half of the people in Chile, at least half. So I think it may seem like it closes the constitutional debate, which is something that most people in Chile want. They don't want to be messing with the basic rules and continue this level of instability. But I don't think it will be able to sustain stability in the long run. On the contrary, I think the experts' text, because this text was the product of two steps. We had a first step where an expert commission was appointed by political parties in Congress that were roughly tied. So it was roughly 50-50 left and right. And then this draft was passed to the council elected, which was tilted much more to the right. And the council made changes to the draft that polarized, I would say, this text. I think the experts commission text was a balanced text, was of course not what the left likes. It was also not what the right would prefer. And I think that's how it should be. It was a text that was a minimal agreement amongst groups that don't agree. So I think that was a much better text for stability. I think this text has the same problems as the previous one in the sense that it's not inclusive and that it may trigger discontent, and we could have another social outburst, perhaps not now, but in a few years.
The question is how it was, so difficult to find a balance, a proposal that can build, or create sort of a better consensus for the Chilean population.
Well, of course, the electoral result really defined this, but I think the fact that we have outsiders challenging the political system is a big issue. The first convention was not led by traditional left-wing political parties. It was basically the reason why this proposal had some things that look strange to most constitutions in the world, had to do with single issue representatives from social movements, grassroots movements that were not traditional political actors. And in this case, it's the same with the opposite political sign. We have many, as I said, Republican leaders who are challenging the political right, who challenge and who are against the idea of negotiating, of, politics. And they say, we don't deal with that. We are not traditional politicians. We represent the people, the true beliefs of the people. So there's a populist discourse, both on the left and the right. And I think this constitution has a lot of populist traits. It has tax exemptions in the constitution. It regulates migration through the constitution. It has things that really don't belong in a constitution. And I think that's because we have the electoral rise of challengers of traditional politics. So I think bottom line, we are suffering from the same as many, many countries in the world are suffering, which is the loss of trust of political parties, the crisis of political representation, and the incapacity to build political proposals that gather the support of people. When you're an outsider, you have no responsibility. You're not accountable for the decisions you make afterwards. So you go and you defend till the end what you believe in. When you are in politics, you know that, you need to negotiate and you're not going to reach your optimum. You need to compromise.
Overall, what does this mean for President Boric, who came from a progressive movement, okay, and he was elected on a progressive platform. And now, he needs in some way to continue shepherding this process, okay, that putting in front of the Chilean society, all right? So, what is your take in the implication for this, for a president that is having a dwindling popularity nowadays as well?
Well, his popularity is not so bad compared to others at this time, in this moment of his presidency. But of course, this whole constitutional process has been damaging for his political program, particularly the rejection. What really damaged the government was the rejection of the previous proposal, because the President Boric and his coalition, his left-wing coalition, rose with the tide of the social outburst. So it's inevitable that the political constitutional process is tied to his destiny. Of course, he would prefer not to have this issue in the horizon, but it's inevitable, in my opinion. And he's going to work to make the text known. And the parties and the campaigns will have the duty to try to tilt public opinion towards one side or the other. It's less painful if the draft is rejected, but the big punch was in September 4, was the loss of the plebiscite of the referendum for the Constitutional Convention's text. That was the defeat of the left. But I think also that Boric as a figure has broader support than his political parties. He doesn't have a very stable base. His party was created for his candidacy. It's not a political party like the Socialist Party. It doesn't have a tradition or roots or a program. It's basically the people that wanted Boric to be the candidate. So there's also like a weakness in that sector. All the Frente Amplio, the Ample Front, the New Left is extremely weak institutionally. And so I think what's happening now, it's a sort of reaccommodation of the left, where really up to now, what is growing among the left is the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party has become a very important actor in the government. They were not in the government before. They did not support Boric. They voted for another. They had their own candidate. So they were not part of in the first round, in the first presidential round. But then they entered government and they have become more and more important. So today, I think that the new left that comes from social movement is weakening, and the old left, of particularly the more moderate left, the Socialist Party, is becoming stronger. And some people that had renounced the party are coming back. When you're defeated, you unite. I think there was more fragmentation when they had the lead. Now the fragmentation is on the right because they have the lead, because they have the support, and so everybody wants to be the boss. The left is so on the ground now that they're, rallying together, getting together.
Switching gears for a moment, if we just sort of review the economic conditions taking place nowadays in Chile, Chile's economic activity has been falling quite significantly this year. Real GDP, for example, is forecast to contract 0.4%, in 2023. However, when seeing some data in September that is suggesting that the economy some way, somehow is leveling off. Activity rose 0.6% in September from the previous month. Mining, which is a very critical and important sector for Chile, rose almost 3% in the same month, representing still, a main driver for growth. That is according to the figures released by the central banks. All of this sense that things are not as bad as, they look earlier in the year, could in some way change the political move and help in this process?
I mean, we have more economic stability. There's more optimism, and we're not going to grow very much, but we're still growing. And inflation is being reduced. I think after all the turmoil of the last years, there's a very big sense that we need to be careful with fiscal responsibility. The withdrawal of pension funds during the pandemic was extremely responsible. It was promoted by legislators from left and right. And I think we've seen that this kind of populist policies really damage the economy. And I think there's a sense that we're on a good track. But on the other hand, there's still, I think, as I said before, like a trauma of all the hard times that we lived in recent years, and particularly regarding public order, the increase of migration. We were not traditionally a country that received too much migration, and we have received many migrants from other countries in Latin America in the recent years, and that's creating really even a humanitarian crisis in some places. And I think all these problems also give a sense that create a conservative, that redistribution or social policy that's not as important as public order and particularly economic stability. And that's usually more beneficial to the right-wing programs.
Back in October, a poll done by Cadén, one of the, well-known pollsters in Chile, showed that 52% of the population of the respondents of these surveys, 54% of those are planning to vote against the new draft in December. What are the prospects of a passage of the reform from your point of view?
Well, the campaign has not started yet. And the difference today, depending on the poll you see, is between 15 and 20%. So to pass this text, the supporters of the draft would have to gain around 15 to 20% of voters who are now undecided. There's many people who are undecided, and I think those undecided votes are the ones that may tilt the balance towards one side or the other. So far, the text looks like it's going to be rejected. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that it may be approved. There are some candy in the text. I think the idea of not paying contributions and the idea of putting an end to the constitutional debate are things that are important for the approval campaign. And also the reduction of Congress. The Constitution has a proposal to reduce the number of Congress people. So the idea that we're going to have less politicians, we're going to spend less taxpayers' money in politicians, is something that is also attractive. I think these are rather populist measures, but are probably effective. So they may change a little bit this tendency that we see nowadays. And also we now have mandatory vote. And the thing is that with mandatory vote, 4.5 million new voters entered the system, which had not been present before. Mandatory vote completely changed the landscape. The mandatory vote introduced 4.5 million voters who overwhelmingly voted for the extreme right, for the right. They voted to reject, they voted to elect the Republicans in the convention, and they're probably going to keep voting right in this new election.
If we have an outcome like that one, what is this one will mean for another reforms that the President Boric is pushing, such as tax reform, the pension reforms? Will actually this improve the likelihood of those reforms being subsequently approved later on?
I don't think so. I think the rejection in September 4 really pushed back the reforms that President Boric was trying to agree. The right had already agreed on some things about pension reforms, and it retracted. It went back from what it had offered previously after the defeat of the constitutional proposal, because it saw a chance of, having more power in representation of right-wing agendas. So we're really not in a good moment for social reforms right now. And I think a triumph of this text would make it still less likely.
That is very interesting, Claudia, because that will help us just to dive a little bit in the political status of the opposition. The right-wing Republican Party, Republicanos, led by Jose Antonio Caz, who was the runner-up of the election versus Boric, were the main responsibles, for drafting the new constitution. Is this a moment, a political moment for them in some way, somehow?
I think they're hoping that. There was some uncertainty because we saw a division of the right with a more traditional right trying to look more moderate and siding the Republicans to the corner. But now we're seeing an alliance. So I think that alliance can be very successful in turning away the result and moving forward this more right-wing agenda. There's also a question about what happens to the center. There's been a division, and some former Christian Democrats that form new parties like Amarillos and Demócratas, they're really tilting towards the right. But the Christian democracy is debating whether to support or not the text. The president said that he doesn't support it. He's against. But the party doesn't have still a formal party position. They're going to announce it in a few days.
Very, very interesting. One thing that usually fascinates me about this process, Claudia, I have to confess this, is just simply the possibility of recasting the Constitution. How many countries nowadays are embarking in a similar process that you know of, for example?
Well, actually, there's been a lot of constitutional change recently. You in the United States are not used to this, but if you see your state constitutions, you have a similar rate of constitutional replacement as the rest of the world. The average in the world is around 19 years. There's a very interesting comparative project which compares all the constitutions in the world since the French Revolution. And constitutions change quite a lot, around every 19 years. And we've seen constitutional change recently in Latin America, in Colombia, Argentina after the dictatorship, and Brazil famously had its new constitution in 88. Chile didn't have such a change of regime after the dictatorship. So I think that after the end of an authoritarian regime, like the Franco regime in Spain or like the military dictatorship in Brazil, the political system was able to say, okay, that authoritarianism is over, and now we're going to have a new constitution that includes all the political sectors. And that they achieved that in Brazil or Spain. We did not do that in Chile. And unfortunately, these two efforts were not successful to really create something like what other countries achieve, which is like a common ground to do regular politics. Because I think in both cases in Chile, the majority tried to implement as much as possible their political program through the constitution. And I think the big lesson of this is that really a constitution to be enduring needs a very, very broad consensus and needs not to put limitations on things that are controversial. You cannot resolve controversies through the constitution.
One final question in here, Claudia, if I may, which is, let's play two scenarios, and a scenario where the Constitution is rejected on December 17. What happens after that scenario? And then we review the second one. From your point of view, if this is rejected for the second time, what is next? What is the implication of this?
I think if it's rejected, I think that's a scenario, it's a better scenario in my opinion for stability, because we have a constitution that already suffered important changes since the outburst. So I think the reasons that really made all these systems so unpopular are no longer there. And so I think that's why I'm not saying that the constitution is no longer a problem, but I think it's much less of a problem than it was in 2019.
And for President Boric, this scenario, this rejection scenario, will imply that he will pass into the annals of history as a very unique president, had been, suffer, let's put it that way, a rejection, dual rejection on his attempt to recraft or recast, should I say, the Constitution.
I think for the left and for President Boric, this is a catch-22. No matter what happens, he's going to be defeated. As for the right, it's a win. I mean, it doesn't matter what happened, the right wins, because the right never wanted to have a new constitution. So if the text is rejected, they remain with the constitution that they liked in the first place. And if the constitution is approved, then they reinforce something that is more to the right than the previous text. So no matter what happens, the right wins and the left loses.
And that will actually be a great segue to the scenario where this one is approved. So would you say that the Republicanos, el Partido Republicano, led by José Antonio Caz, will actually be the main beneficiary of this process?
I think so. I think today, because anything that happens will benefit the right, the question is really which right. So if the text is rejected, I think that's better for the center right, for the more moderate right, and probably also for economic interests. Whereas if the text is approved, I think that will lead to further tensions, and it would strengthen the extreme right, the populist right of Caz, and would probably enhance the chances of that group to gain the presidency, which, as you know, in Chile is such an important office that it really has to do with everything in political life.
Claudia, it was a real pleasure having you here for the America's Quarterly podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.